As you may have guessed, if you came here deliberately, the topic is rape culture, transphobia, and how communities can resist. We'll be dealing with a lot of intersectional topics and also a lot of very serious violence. I'm going to begin just with a trigger warning for the sake of the health and safety of our audience members. This talk will discuss sexual violence, which may be triggering and traumatic for some audience members. Graphic details aren't going to be discussed. They do get mentioned in some of the legal documents that I'm basing a lot of this off of, and in some of the studies that I'm basing this off of, but I'm not going to bring them up. But assaults, rapes, victim blaming, and other serious issues of sexual violence are going to come up, and I completely respect if anyone needs to set any boundaries or needs to step out of the space if they experience difficulties, and I hope that this will be more enlightening than it will be triggering. So one source that I tend to look back to a lot for information on the intersection of rape culture and transphobia and trans identities is the Injustice at Every Turn report that was put together by the National Center for Transgender Equality back in 2011. It was a nationwide survey of transgender, gender nonconforming, cross-dressing, genderqueer, just a pretty broad trans spectrum. And it basically just self-reported data on the type of discrimination and abuse that trans people have suffered. And so to give you an idea of some of the evidence that it revealed related to sexual assault, 10% of respondents experienced sexual assault that they attributed to anti-trans bias. So I'm not sure quite how they gathered that attribution, but I would imagine that this was people who were behaving transphobically towards them, and their transphobic behaviors and harassment and assaults included sexual violence. And among those who expressed gender nonconforming or transgender identities in K through 12 educational settings, 12% of those experienced sexual violence. So we're not just talking about stranger rapes in public spaces, we're largely talking about sexual violence in spaces that should be safe for people, in spaces like schools. We're talking about this happening to trans youth. And so that gives you an idea of some of the severity of the problem. But this is also an intersectional issue. This is not just about trans identities. Racism plays a very real role. So this data is also from the Injustice at Every Turn report in 2011. With sexual assault in schools, we see clear racial variance. American Indian trans people, 24% of them who were displaying gender nonconforming or trans identities in their K through 12 education experienced this. Multiracial people experienced sexual violence at a rate of 18%. Asian trans folks experienced this sexual violence at a rate of 17% of the population, and black trans people experienced 15% of those respondents experienced sexual assault. So they experienced sexual assault at substantially higher rates than students of other races. We also see an intersection of racism and systemic poverty. We all know that trans people experience disproportionate and appalling rates of homelessness, often being kicked out of their homes, often being economically insecure because of housing discrimination and employment discrimination. And that's exacerbated along racial lines. So the report found that an alarming 41% of black respondents said they had experienced homelessness at some point in their lives, over 5 times the rate of the general US population. And 31% of those homeless black trans people experienced sexual assault in homeless shelters. So structural poverty is an issue that is intimately related to rape culture. Race continues to have impact. From the same report, we find that 29% of black transgender respondents who had been to jail or prison reported being physically assaulted, and 32% reported being sexually assaulted while in custody. So, again, systematic rape culture in facilities paid for by tax dollars, operated by the state, with clear racism and transphobia playing a role. There's also intersections with ableism, so we can't just look at gender identity in isolation or race in isolation. Disability matters too. 30% of trans people, according to the Injustice at Every Turn report, identify as having some sort of disability that affects their life in a major way. And as an autistic activist, I tend to have mostly data related to developmental disabilities, so I want to give you a bit of an idea of how sexual violence relates to developmental disabilities, and to some extent this extends to ableism in general, I suspect, although I don't have as much data on that. So one study in 2001 found that 80% of women and 60% of men with developmental disabilities have been sexually abused. More than 90% of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse at some point in their lives, according to a report in 1995. Some studies suggest 39 to 68% of girls and 16 to 30% of boys will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday among people with developmental disabilities. And so there's a lot of factors that play into this. Some of it's ableism, some of it's the fact that people with disabilities are extra vulnerable because they wind up needing to have caretakers that play such a central role in their lives and that have such power over them as a result. And so when we're talking about rape culture, we're not just talking about transphobia, we're not just talking about misogyny, we're not just talking about racism, we're also talking about ableism. And so this is an incredibly intersectional issue of abusive violence. Underreporting. According to the 2007 Rape in Utah survey, 88.2% of rapes in Utah are not reported to law enforcement. That's substantially higher than the national average because when it comes to rape data, Utah seems substantially worse than the rest of the country. If we're looking nationally, according to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, which was basing this on several years of Justice Department data from the National Crime Victimization Survey, they found nationally that around 60% of rapes are not reported to police. When they factored that in and used the amount of rapes reported on that survey and compared it with the number of people who are convicted, only 3% of rapists spend a single day in prison. Meanwhile, the prison system substantially re-victimizes survivors of rape. A panel I attended this morning on the criminal justice system and trans folks, someone with the Department of Corrections said that 90% of women in Utah's prison system have a history of sexual abuse. Now, why is rape so underreported? Part of it is because of victim blaming. Now, victim blaming operates through a lot of mechanisms, mostly by shifting scrutiny from the actions of the perpetrator to the actions of the victim, to the actions of the survivor. And so, what does this mean concretely? This can be anything from slut-shaming, a disproportionate focus on what the survivor was wearing at the time, what she or he was doing, their sexual history, and this can also be used, unfortunately, to result in the dismissal of cases. So a 2010 gang rape case was dismissed when it was revealed that the victim had fantasized about group sex. The judge said that the victim's, quote, credibility was shot to pieces. In a 2008 sexual battery case in Georgia, this is a quote from a news report, Judge Philip Brown, despite a Georgia rape shield law, compelled Ross, that's the victim, to disclose every person she had ever dated or engaged in sexual activity with, including their names, dates of interaction, and contact information. Rather than being treated with sympathy, rather than being supported and trying to get restitution and restoration for survivors, the system, unfortunately, and there have been gains to prevent this, largely in the form of rape shield laws. I don't want to overstate the case, but even relatively recently, we have these cases where slut-shaming isn't just perpetrated by people in the victim's social circle, it's perpetrated by the legal system with disastrous consequences for the survivor and with disastrous invasiveness. We should not be invading the privacy and the intimate details of the lives of sexual assault survivors. Now, as you might imagine, transphobia tends to exacerbate victim blaming, and there's one study in particular that I looked at in preparing for this talk, which was a 2011 study in the Journal of Homosexuality, which I better get a subscription to. It's a good time for a journal. Anyway, called Judgments Towards Male and Transgendered Victims in a Depicted Stranger Rape. It interviewed 133 participants, 75 males and 58 females, gathered from pubs and bars near Liverpool in the UK, and they answered questions about a story related to a stranger rape. What they varied for the respondents was they varied the identity of the victim. So in some cases, the victim was a heterosexual male. In some cases, the victim was a gay man. In some cases, the victim was a cross-dresser. And in other cases, the victim was listed as a trans woman or a trans man. And here's the results they found. Although the assault was considered equally severe regardless of the victim's status, a significant difference was revealed for blame, such that heterosexual male victims were blamed the least, while the cross-dresser victim was blamed the most. Inspection of the means revealed that the FTM and MTF transsexual victims were attributed almost as much blame as was the cross-dresser, although these differences did not reach statistical significance. This shows that negativity in judgments is apparent for transgender victims of rape. And now, to be clear, this is not immutable. This varied substantially based on who the respondents of the survey were. Heterosexual males were much more likely, because of their adherence and conformity, this was the researcher's speculation, that because of their adherence and conformity to gender roles, they were much more likely to police the gender roles of the victim, and so, gay men, lesbian women, and heterosexual women were much less likely to victim blame, and this shows that this is definitely not immutable. The upshot here is that this is something we can change, and also we should note that while there's clear reasons to believe that this victim blaming extends pervasively throughout our society, and there are cases we could point to that show this, this is something that can be changed, and there are people who victim blame less and people who victim blame more. So this is not immutable, and there's direct actions we can take to change this. Rape culture is clearly related, particularly as it affects trans women and trans people in general, is clearly related to our criminal justice system. This is a sheet that I find really useful, a flowchart created by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, which is a law center that provides services to primarily transgender populations and emphasizes a lot of services for people in poverty, that documents how the criminal justice system winds up disproportionately impacting trans people. And there's two ways in which this happens. One, criminalization of poor and homeless people, while trans people are made disproportionately homeless and poor. So you need to afford your hormones or your medical treatment, combine this with pervasive employment discrimination, education discrimination, discrimination in housing, you're going to be at greater risk of needing to commit survival crimes, whether that's petty theft or whether that's sleeping outside or engaging in other crimes that are only crimes because cities and governments want to criminalize the homeless in order to keep them out of sight and out of mind, or whether it's engaging in criminalized forms of exchange and work, so going into the underground economy of drugs and sex work. You're going to be criminalized in this sense. And trans people themselves are also criminalized. There have been false arrests for trans people using the, quote, wrong bathroom, which more accurately is the right bathroom, the bathroom that actually matches their gender identity, not the identity that they were coercively assigned at birth by a bureaucratic system. There have been cases of police profiling trans people as sex workers, even if they're not. You're walking in a certain area at night and you're a trans woman of color, particularly if you have condoms on you in the city of New York or San Francisco. Studies by Human Rights Watch have found that you're likely to be profiled as a sex worker. Then there's cases involving identity documents where you can be accused of fraud for trying to, Ruby, for those of you who were at the keynote, Ruby mentioned that she was essentially accused of trying to commit fraud for listing her gender identity when her identity documents didn't match that. So the fact that the bureaucratic institutions that dominate our society don't keep up with the individual identities and the gender self-determination of trans people, that directly impacts criminalization. And then once you're in the prison system, once you face this type of harassment, you're likely to be subjected, as Ruby explained, to isolation, to solitary confinement, to torture, or if not that, you're put in a general population where you're subjected to disproportionate risks of sexual violence there. So this simultaneously creates a reason not to want to interact with the system, not to want to report acts of violence, thus allowing perpetrators to get away with it. And it enables the system itself and those who work for it to become perpetrators. It allows cops and prison guards to abuse trans people and other marginalized people. It is rape culture writ large. more evidence regarding criminalization. A recent study of stop and frisk practices in New York. These are invasive searches where police can stop and frisk anyone based on their suspicion. Most people who study these practices know that upwards of 88%, somewhere in the 90s percentiles of people subjected to these searches are people of color. Very few of them are white, but there's also clear transphobia and homophobia and gender policing involved in this. 28% of straight and cisgender respondents that responded to this survey had been stopped and frisked. 51% of LGBTQ respondents had, and 59% of transgender and gender nonconforming respondents had. For another piece of evidence related to criminalization, I got this evidence from an article in The Nation. If we're looking at criminalization of LGBTQ youth, 50% of gay youth picked up for nonviolent offenses in Louisiana in 2009 were sent to jail to await trial, while less than 10% of straight kids were. And this creates not only harsher treatment pre-trial, before you've even had your due process rights, it also jeopardizes your chances at trial because there's prejudice against the defendant if they're brought out in chains, if they're brought out from a jail, rather than if they come in from home. People will be more likely to assume that they've done something wrong, that they're a more serious offender. And so it's pretty straightforward what this means for underreporting. In the 2011 Injustice at Every Turn survey, 46%, nearly half of transgender respondents said they were uncomfortable seeking police assistance. And that's completely understandable when you're profiled, when you see your community criminalized by police, and it's particularly understandable for those who are forced into survival crimes by structural poverty. And we see similar dynamics in other marginalized communities. Undocumented immigrants, for example, often find it very difficult to seek police assistance because they know that if they interact with police, that puts them at risk of being swept up in the Secure Communities program and deported and sent to a detention center. People in black communities often find it difficult to seek police assistance because the police aren't there to protect and serve them. In their experience, the police are there to stop and frisk them. They're there to beat them. They're there to kill Rodney King. This type of dynamic of oppression from the police makes it so that people in marginalized communities can't report serious violent crimes, whether we're talking hate crimes, whether we're talking domestic abuse, whether we're talking sexual assault and rape. And as I alluded to earlier, sometimes police and prisons are the abusers. A 2007 study of California prisons found that sexual assault is 13 times more prevalent among transgender inmates, with 59% reporting being sexually assaulted, and 67% of inmates who identified as LGBTQ reporting being sexually assaulted while incarcerated. That's a rate 15 times more prevalent than that of the general inmate population. So that's in California as of 2007. We see similar dynamics in immigration detention centers. Tanya Guzman Martinez is a transgender woman who was locked up in the Eloy Detention Center in Arizona, which is run for profit by the Corrections Corporation of America. She was harassed, sexually assaulted by both guards and inmates, and I'm not going to go into detail about the assaults, but they're particularly brutal. This was a rare case in that while the guard had threatened her with deportation, and she eventually got asylum because if she was sent back to her home country, she could be killed, much like many of the immigrants that Ruby talked about earlier at the keynote. She got asylum because she could die if she were deported. And she was threatened with deportation if she reported these assaults, both by inmates who assaulted her and by a guard who assaulted her. But she reported, and the guard was charged with a crime, but he was convicted not of sexual assault, but of attempted unwanted sexual contact, which is a euphemistic, lesser charge. He was sentenced to 2 days' time served, whereas the minimum he would have gotten under Arizona law had he been convicted of sexual assault was, if I remember correctly, 5.5 years. And this shows one dynamic of how rape culture operates, is you wind up, particularly with privileged people who work for the legal system, taking the charge down a couple notches to something that's essentially the same charge, but is a lesser charge in terms of the punishment. A similar case happened that I read about in Texas, where a police officer raped a transgender woman, and who he had picked up on a charge of her being a prostitute. While she was in custody, he raped her. There was DNA evidence against him, and there's no possibility of actual consent there because she was in his custody. He was a man with a gun and legal authority to detain her, ordering her to engage in sexual acts, and there was DNA evidence against him. That's an open and shut rape case, much less ambiguous than than the ones that we often actually successfully prosecute. Well, not often, only 3% of rapists spend a night in prison. But it was much more open and shut than many cases, and yet, because citing the fact that other than this incident, the officer had been a good cop, the prosecutor brought it down to an official oppression charge. Meanwhile, the victim was incarcerated in a men's prison where she was likely to be sexually assaulted again. More evidence. Guards have been known to force trans women into prostitution for inmates. I'm not going to go into much detail on this, but in an appendix to her book, Resistance Behind Bars, Victoria Law documents a bit of this, and in particular she cites testimony before Congress and before some commissions related to the Prison Rape Elimination Act by an attorney with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, I think Gabriel Arkels, but I could be getting that wrong. Similarly, as I alluded to earlier, police in cities including New York and San Francisco have been found profiling trans women as prostitutes and then sexually assaulting them. Moreover, these are the cases we recognize as sexual abuse and that the law recognizes as sexual abuse, but strip searches themselves can be a form of sexual abuse. Angela Davis, the feminist scholar, refers to strip searches as a routinization of sexual assault. Particularly in cavity searches, they often literally meet the FBI's legal definition of rape. In the general case, they can be sexually humiliating and abusive, and particularly triggering for survivors, even if they don't meet the legal definition. In a brief for a Supreme Court case in the past couple of years, Stetson and Ellsworth, two feminist lawyers, cite a bunch of evidence related to how triggering strip searches can be. And so this is essentially routinized sexual assault by the state, and trans women and trans people in general tend to receive an even harsher version of this because they're not always subject to best practices regarding the gender of who's going to search them. So the sexual humiliation angle of it is exacerbated by the fact that the strip search outs them. If they weren't out to the officers and guards before, and they're not post-op, then their genitals are exposed, and they're outed as trans. Moreover, if they're already expected to be trans, then they'll often have someone of a gender other than the one they identify with searching them. And so something that can already constitute literally a form of sexual abuse, that can, even when it doesn't meet legal definitions of sexual abuse, be triggering for sexual assault survivors, is made even more traumatic and abusive for trans people. So let's get to the practical side. There are ways to challenge rape culture, and we can challenge rape culture. A lot of it happens on the ideological and interpersonal level. So challenge victim blaming, challenge rape myths, and challenge the types of bigotry I mentioned. So if someone promotes a rape myth, if someone engages in, yes?
What do you mean specifically by rape myth?
Okay, so there are a lot of rape myths. Here's one that I encounter a lot. Oh, you got an example?
Want an example? Guys can be raped.
Yes.
Oh God, I hate that.
Exactly. Perfect example of a rape myth. And that's one that also, because people often misgender trans people, is often used to create a lot of victim blaming and dismissal around trans survivors as well. And it's a particularly pernicious myth. Another one is that rapes are primarily something that happens because of a stranger in the bushes, that archetype, when in fact the majority of sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows. And so what this results in practice, is that people start engaging in these dismissive tactics towards survivors, where they say, but you knew him, but you'd had sex with him before, but you had, XYZ with this person, but you went and saw them again, but you were married, how can that be rape? All these different forms of dismissive tactics that are rooted in this myth that it's just stranger rape. And then there's a whole litany of other forms of abuse and dismissal that come from the myth that only women get raped. And so those are two examples that you should challenge whenever you see a manifestation of. Jessica?
A majority of those are just specific versions of implied consent bullshit. That
Exactly.
there are so many situations that people would take on as implied consent when realistically and in an ideal situation, there is never an implied consent situation. Ever,
Exactly.
ever.
Exactly, and that goes to this point, teach enthusiastic consent. The way people conceptualize consent in this society is so weak compared to what it could be, compared to what it should be. People don't think that you need there are people who don't think that you need affirmative verbal expressions of desire, affirmative expressions of desire. They just say, well, the absence of no is a yes. No! A yes is a yes. A please fuck me is a yes. The absence of a no is not a yes. And there are direct examples of organizations that are promoting better values around consent. And one organization that I have a lot of respect for is Force, Upsetting Rape Culture, which engages in a lot of sort of culture jamming types of activities. They created a website a while ago that was satirizing some of Victoria's Secret's sexy underwear that had just messages that were sort of expressing blanket sexiness, and they put out a site that was advertising things like panties that said ask me or ask first, or various ones that promoted consent positive and consent emphasizing messages. Similarly, they recently did a thing releasing a satire claiming to be a release from Playboy that was saying that they were changing their college issue not to just being about the best party campuses, but the campuses with the best consent culture. Now, what's particularly upsetting about how the activists at Force Upsetting Rape Culture have been treated is that the corporations that they satirize have typically filed trademark complaints against their culture jamming activities in order to try to shut down their websites. They've used intellectual property law to try to shut down debate, feminist speech, and parody. This clearly falls under fair use, but corporations don't like being criticized, they don't like getting negative press, and they apparently are ignorant of the Streisand effect, which shows that you're going to actually get more negative press when you try to censor stuff, that you're going to get people like me complaining about how you're a trademark troll who engages in these dishonest, disingenuous, and censorious uses of intellectual property law to try to shut down a vital conversation to challenge a critically dangerous social ill. The bottom lines of corporations should not be bolstered by using state power to shut down feminist speech, to shut down attempts to move our culture towards better values around what consent is. Another example of a good campaign is the Don't Be That Guy campaign, which is based in Canada. They put up a series of posters that were saying that I should have put images in the slideshow, but just thought of that now. This is,
Note to self.
yeah, note to self, next time I do this presentation there will be images, but shows people in various positions in which they might, for example, be, that might be associated with risk of acquaintance rape or date rape, and say things like, just because she's drunk doesn't mean she wants to fuck. And various other short, simple, catchy slogans that express that you need actual consent, that someone going out partying is not asking to be sexually assaulted, and that you should respect people's bodily autonomy and physical boundaries and embrace norms of real, enthusiastic consent. Which brings us to promoting bystander intervention. Often, acts of sexual assault, particularly in party types of spaces, happen in social spaces where bystanders could intervene. Take the Steubenville rapes, for example, that were huge in the news recently. Well, not too recently, I guess last spring was it? But the Steubenville rapes happened at a drunken high school party. There were multiple witnesses, one of whom I believe his name, I'm not going to speculate because I recall his name, but I could be mixing it up. Anyway, one of the observers, when asked why he didn't intervene to stop the assault, said, it wasn't, quote, it wasn't violent, I didn't know exactly what rape was. Well, it was an act of violence. It was directly violating this passed out woman's bodily autonomy. But it wasn't visibly violent, it wasn't a stranger in the bushes jumping her while she screamed, no, no, no. It was someone who was passed out being sexually violated, and because we don't teach about what consent looks like and what rape looks like, and because we don't teach people how to be effective bystanders, they didn't intervene, and they often don't, and you can intervene, and all of us should. Bystander intervention is essentially interfering with sexual assaults before or as they occur. So you're in a bar, you see someone repeatedly sort of pushing the boundaries of someone, that's a space in which you could intervene. You could ask the potential victim, do you need to get away from that space? You could confront, at some level, the abuser who continues to push or violate boundaries of someone who's drinking. That's often a tactic that rapists use to groom their victims. Or if you're in a more extreme case, like the one I described with the Steubenville rapes, you can call abusers out and hopefully have a culture and a social circle of people who will join you in intervening. This also has the effect of making abusive behaviors socially unacceptable, because right now our society unfortunately gives rapists and abusers significant leeway and social license to operate. Right now there's cultural norms of masculinity that say you shouldn't necessarily take no for an answer. They don't overtly promote rape, but they do say that, well, ask again, that she's playing hard to get, that you should break down these walls of resistance, and they're reinforced by people not intervening when they see people violating boundaries. Yeah?
I was just thinking about that twerking incident, with Miley Cyrus at some award, the music.
Yeah, I think the VMAs.
But the song that she was quote unquote twerking to was by that guy.
Robin Thicke,
and
Blurred Lines.
it's called Blurred Lines or something, and
Yeah.
you want it.
Yep.
I mean, so social media
Mhm.
being peddled to younger and younger and younger children even in society is furthering the cause of making such thing as appropriate bystander intervention impossible.
It made that a really interesting situation too, because afterward, he took the position of, that wasn't in the rehearsal and I wasn't comfortable with what she was doing. Like, are you shitting me? Listen to the song you're writing. Like, no, I mean, all of it's unacceptable, but it made it a really interesting dynamic to me. I mean, he took that position like,
Right, she got
shouldn't be
slut
whatever.
shamed,
somehow
but
she's
she didn't
blamed,
get called
yeah.
out for his song at all. She
Yeah.
was slut
Right,
shamed.
but everybody's
They
like,
always do
she
that to
looks
the
like a
Disney
slut.
girls,
Like,
but
have
not
you
the
listened to the words of
boys.
this song?
She was not only slut shamed, but she was
Right.
also culturally
Right.
ostracized because
Right.
people of color were saying, that's our dance, you can't do our dance. So it was like this whole,
Yeah, although that's
Cultural-
actually, the cultural appropriation
No,
arguments I think are legitimate for people to
absolutely.
be making.
Sure.
And so I don't think we
So-
should be conflating the two, but.
Right.
no,
Yeah.
but they intersect
Yeah.
as far as culture goes.
And it's really interesting, because looking at the gaming industry, and that's the one that I work in, you look at how women are treated online, like Xbox Live and things like that, and you also look at the types of games that are created, and they perpetuate that hypermasculinity, they perpetuate this social group that's between the ages of 16 and 24. That's what game developers and development houses think is the magic population that makes all that money. And so you just see this interesting dynamic where you have these immature little kids, and even men, like grown men, that are just treating women like shit.
Yeah.
And so you look at how can you change that? You have games like BioWare that try to make it doesn't matter what gender you are, like you're still this super powerful person that can save the galaxy. Or you look at games like the new Tomb Raider that actually face and confront rape head on, and they show a scene where Lara Croft is being sexually assaulted, and that's what changes her from being just an explorer to the Lara Croft that you know and respect. So you have things like that that are going on, but then you have other games that don't do anything with it, where they have just women that are.
Or they promote it.
Yeah, they're
Right, well,
like God of War.
unfortunately, yeah, they're financially obligated to serve the culture of these people, and when really they could be taking a head start and encouraging them to point their ideals in a different direction, but unfortunately they're just subservient.
Yeah.
You know, when you mention all gaming things, something else that kind of, you know, bothers me is when you go online, you know, the way people use terminology, even when women are involved. You know, a lot of times I'm hearing like, you know, oh, we totally raped your team and stuff like that. I was actually kind of watching my cousins, because they used all that, you know, sort of language and everything, and it's like, I kind of noticed as they're going along, they were being more desensitized. It was like they didn't understand, you know, what rape was or how serious, you know, a topic it was.
Yeah, and I used to play
That it was
World of
something they
Warcraft.
could just joke about.
A good example
Yeah,
of
and-
that would be like the Halo games where after someone's dead, they would crouch above them.
Oh, God.
Teabagging.
Yeah, sexually assaulting and assault as a method of denigrating a corpse
Dehumanizing.
and dehumanizing a victim is actually something that armies that have less respect for human rights sometimes do in war.
Right.
And this is a real type of war crime that happens, and it's glorified in certain segments of gamer culture. And similarly, you see that sort of thing. You were mentioning how they use rape as just a term for
Colloquially.
colloquially as a term for successfully dominating their opponents, and it is a form of domination. It shows that rape, it relates to how rape is about power more than about sex, but it's this particularly grotesque way of treating it as something that's somehow positive and admirable and desensitizing them to the concept.
And almost that it's absolutely necessary if you're going to obtain power, that there are going to be people that are going to get fucked with along the way, and if you want to have power, you just have to accept that you're going to have to do that at some point, which is also completely unacceptable, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. It promotes an ideal of power over rather than power with, of power as methods of domination and violence rather than empowerment that can happen voluntarily, peacefully through people getting better together. Should I move on to the next slide, or is there more we want to discuss with bystander intervention? Another thing we can do that's a bit bigger, well, I mean, what I've described so far in terms of goals is big, but it's something you do on an interpersonal level and can implement into your social practices regardless of whether you have organizations backing you, although organizational backing through groups like Force Upsetting Rape Culture or the Don't Be That Guy campaign is incredibly useful. But you can build alternatives to police and prisons, because when marginalized populations, and populations in general, don't feel they can go to the police, they should have recourse. And that means building alternative institutions. And one organization that's really been doing fantastic work about that in New York, more around hate crimes than around rape, but it provides a useful analog for what we can do around violence generally, is the Audre Lorde Project, which is a group mostly of LGBTQ people of color in New York City, and they have their Safe Outside the System collective, which has a safe neighborhood campaign, which organizes and educates local businesses and community organizations on how to stop violence without relying on law enforcement. So what they do is they go to local businesses, they go to community spaces, and they work with them to train the people who work there and the people who manage those spaces to de-escalate violent situations, to stop people who are engaging in harassment and hate against members of marginalized groups, particularly against trans people, and to engage in essentially bystander intervention. So it's implementing bystander intervention on an institutional scale in community spaces, and this provides a way to directly counter this stuff as it happens, and to create safer spaces for members of our community so that they don't feel like they have to only go to the clubs, so that they don't feel like they have to not be able to walk down the street, so that they know if I go along this path, there's a safer space that I can go into as sanctuary from this kind of stuff. And that's something that I really think we could potentially replicate in Salt Lake by getting sympathetic businesses on board with a similar type of training program. And I'd be interested in hearing what people might be willing to do around that, because I don't know that we have anything similar here. More alternatives that were designed around murders of black women back in the late 70s, early 80s. This is a quote from a recent Victoria Law article published in Bitch magazine, where she's talking about a recent racist murder and how charges haven't been brought against the perpetrator, a white man who just killed a woman of color. And she talks about some potential alternatives. So they created, back in the late 70s in Boston, black women worked within their community to create the Dorchester Green Light program. And this program essentially provided safe houses for women who were threatened or assaulted on the streets. And so basically people organizing this program visited and spoke at community groups and gatherings in their areas, and they got residents to open their homes as safe houses, and they had to go through essentially background checks first to make sure that those houses would actually be safe for women, and they'd have to get references, and then they'd attend training sessions for how to provide that kind of safety, and also to learn self-defense. And they got a green light bulb to put on their porch so that when someone was at home, they could turn it on to signal to people who were in trouble, you can come here, this is a safe space. Within 8 months of setting up the program, over 100 safe houses had been established. And so this is something you can do outside of the existing political order by building community to make our spaces safer for people.
Is this typically more effective for the stranger rate that we?
Yeah, that's more effective.
That's kind of the fallacy though, right? That's, I mean, while it is cool, how many people?
Yeah, well that would be more effective mostly I think for hate crimes, because hate crimes are more likely to happen on the street. And then for more like stranger rape stuff, the bystander intervention approach being implemented more in bars and in party type spaces is more useful in that case, as well as educating people on enthusiastic consent so as to limit the types of, so as to decrease the risk of the types of intimate partner assault and intimate partner violence that happens in spaces that are sufficiently private that we don't really have a way to intervene. And so for acquaintance rape, most of the solutions that I'm aware of and familiar with, and if people have other ideas, I'd be very happy to hear them and to discuss them, were mostly discussed in the bystander intervention section. This has more application to stuff like stranger rape and more importantly, well not more importantly, but in terms of more statistical significance, to hate crimes, which is very relevant to the trans community and to the LGBTQ community more broadly. This option has more potential for intimate partner violence, which was a project called the Sister to Sister Collective that was started in New York in 2000 after the police murdered 2 young women of color. They started a group that gathered these sisterhood circles, and I learned this is from that same article that I got the quote from the last one from. Victoria Law also covers this in her video, which I would encourage you to look up, called Resisting Gender Violence Without Cops or Prisons, which discusses a variety of different ways to build these community-based institutions and organizations to help resist gender violence. But this involved essentially creating safe spaces, as I mentioned, and gathering in these sisterhood circles to talk about acts of violence being perpetrated against them and to talk about what might be a good solution to this and how to develop resolution. I remember Victoria Law in the video I mentioned told one story of a woman who mentioned that her ex was harassing her. He was engaged in harassment and stalking. Textbook abusive behaviors. What the women decided to do was to go to his workplace and confront him in front of his coworkers and friends, call him out on what he was doing. And so when they did this, his boss said, okay, you need to stop this. If this continues, you're fired. And so this can use social clout and social power to influence and stop and deter abusers within communities that don't feel they can get justice through the legal system.
Now, what happens when that kind of support backfires? Because, I mean, you can, with the prejudice and the profiling that we've talked about, that can happen in the workplace. So if you try to use that social power, and you go to the public space and you say, this is what you're doing, there may not be any repercussions. The boss may not say, oh, you know, whatever, like you're just being a dude, you know, who cares?
Yeah.
So what?
Well,
kind of-
and then you need to change tactics essentially, so that sometimes that tactic might fail. And if that tactic fails, then you need to regroup and say, what can we do? What's the next step? And so there is no panacea, unfortunately, but there are some tactics that are more available to marginalized people than others, and you're right, they won't always work. And so you need to be considering what might be the next step in that case. And I don't know what the next step would be, and it's not my role to dictate to survivors of violence and victims of abuse what they should be doing about it, but that's one thing they can do, and if that fails, then they can pursue other means, and I'd be happy to assist and discuss what those other means might look like and to hear ideas about that. So, the upshot here is resistance comes in many forms. A lot of it is ideological and happens on a conversational level. It's challenging myths and norms. It's questioning the dude bro who told a rape joke. It's telling people when they say really fucked up things about trans people why they're wrong, and breaking down those prejudices that can exacerbate victim blaming and that can be used as the justifications for violence. So that's the day-to-day. It can be practicing bystander intervention, which hopefully you don't have to do too often, because hopefully you're not witnessing rapes every day. But but that's something that people can do depending on the social spaces they're in, and that's something that we can learn to do and that we can try to develop trainings to teach others to do and can attend trainings in relation to. Yep.
Yeah, it's just interesting because in my rhetoric class we talk about deterministic screens, which is basically the life that you've lived determines what you see.
Mm-hmm.
I think bystander intervention is definitely the best way to go about preventing rapes, especially like the party scenes and things like that. But how, in order to start that bystander intervention, you need to be able to recognize that it's happening.
Absolutely.
In which case, how do we start teaching people to look for things, to look for situations that they may not normally see?
Mm-hmm.
How do we teach them about
Looks
that?
like you
Go
have
ahead.
some ideas.
Well, it's a little bit of a segue. I mean, to me, you know, as the mom to a young man today, I mean, to me, if we really start at the beginning, it has to do with different parenting styles too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think parents have a really big role to play, as do educators just in general, because there's a lot of toxic gender stereotypes and a lot of toxic ignorance about sex. I mean, Elizabeth Smart has spoken about how after she was raped, she hated herself and felt dirty because of the abstinence-only education she got, and because she was told that having sex meant you were dirty, meant you were less than. And so we need to start changing the way we talk to kids about sex, and that's uncomfortable for a lot of people to think about because there's a lot of stigma around talking about that sort of stuff with children.
Oh, I was just going to say, along the lines of identifying what you should intervene in, I'd definitely say trust your gut. I mean, there's a lot of body language that helps to identify uncomfortable situations. And even if it is not something that's going to escalate to sexual assault or something, I'm pretty sure that anyone who is having an issue, like maybe they're uncomfortable with the conversation or something, they'll appreciate just kind of interruption, stuff like that. And if it isn't welcome, that'll be made clear by both parties. And if it's just one, figure it out.
And to touch on that too, I mean, if you're witnessing something where you misinterpret the consent role in there and you do intervene, I mean, the repercussions of not intervening versus and being wrong, I mean, it's the night. I would think that's the difference between being able to sleep at night and not, right?
Yeah.
You know, so to intervene, even if you're wrong, that's the time to do it, right?
Absolutely, especially because what we're talking about when we talk about intervention starts with verbal intervention. We're not talking about, oh, I think that guy's a rapist, I'm gonna shoot him. No, we're talking about you go up and you say, hey, do you need some help? Or, hey, are you sure she's okay with that?
Yeah.
And so that's something that doesn't have a risk of you engaging in something that's gonna have collateral damage or engaging in a rights violation.
Even to be aware of something like that going on, a lot of times people can get wrapped up in what's going on. They can be, overly excited, not necessarily being logical, whether they're drunk or compromised some other way. I mean, there's there can be a relation to this as far as like in the kink community, people can be on like certain types of high or whatever after various
subspace and
things.
such.
Yeah, so there are things that can happen that somebody may be mildly out of touch. And so taking that time to go, are you okay?
Yeah.
Do you need any help? Even if at the moment, like they're going, oh yeah, it can give them the second of pause that can mean the difference.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, even if they go a few minutes later, they're like, oh wait, maybe I'm not okay or whatever. But taking the time to take that chance to ask the question can mean all the difference in the end.
Checking in is really a lot of what we're talking about, and it can be very important and very helpful
Well,
in
and just
a
like
lot of these cases.
what was mentioned, like parenting, right? And when we have those conversations with children about sex, to talk about what does enthusiastic consent look like and what does informed consent look like. And that can be really uncomfortable to talk to your child about, like, okay, your sexual partner needs to explicitly say I'm okay with penetration, right? Or whatever it is. But we're already talking about it. So that's the point to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And then something to mention that this isn't, I was in a bank and there was a guy that was kind of harassing a teller next to me, and you could tell she was like a college kid, young girl, and this is an example. This is not an example of how cool I am, right? This is not that. But I said to this patron, hey, you're talking a little too loud and you're standing a little too close for my comfort. You need to back off. And what I recognized by me saying that, everyone else was able to stand behind me because they all felt that way. But it was me that said something, and then everyone else had the freedom to say, yes, we agree. And that was what needed to happen.
Right.
And that teller was like, thank you.
Because you'll take the fear out of saying something.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
It's like, yeah, I can be behind that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And here's this guy who outweighs me by 200 pounds, and I say, you're standing too close to her for my comfort, right? And that gives everyone else the freedom to say, yeah, we can confront this situation as well. So that was kind of the power of just standing up, right?
Absolutely.
I'm forgetting the name of it, but on YouTube recently, I saw clips from a new TV show that's in the Northeast, and they purposefully set up with actors a verbal abuser and a victim. For example, like in bars, and even they showed, for example, this woman as the victimizer, pretending she was putting like a date rape drug in her male dates, who was the victim, the actor victim. Anyway, it showed in various settings when people spoke up, when they didn't, why, and then they would talk, then they would process it afterwards, and it was fascinating. And it's almost like, yes, it would take one small intervention for others to find their
voice.
voices.
Yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. That sounds like the sort of social experience that What Would You Do might have done. They do a lot of those sorts of things.
Oh, is that the name of the
I don't know. I haven't seen that particular clip, so that may be a different show. But What Would You Do does a lot of clips like that.
Yeah.
They've done stuff related to racial profiling
Right.
by having both black and white people engaging in obvious theft in a public
And an
space.
autistic child in a
Yeah.
restaurant.
Yeah, so they do a lot of these social experiments, and it's really useful for asking ourselves, what does bystander intervention look like, and what does being a decent human being
Right.
look like
Right.
in a public space where unethical behavior might be happening. And I think that's ultimately what this is about, is asking what can we do to be the kinds of people who can build a more peaceful society, who can build a society where bodily autonomy really means something, and where we don't face the kind of systematic violence that's out here. And these are just a few of the things you can do, and some of them are little interventions, and some of them are big community projects, and not everyone can commit to every level of work that we're talking about, but everyone can do a little bit.
Everyone could raise their children a little bit better.
Well, everyone with children. And so, are we at time, or?
We've got.
Well, we're supposed to be filling out surveys, but I don't know if anyone actually has any.
Who has the surveys? Because I wasn't provided with those.
Oh, you're not a
Usually it's
volunteer.
someone who's the person supposed to be like sitting in, who's the conference volunteer.
Yeah, we should
Okay,
get some-
thank you so much, Jandy.
Absolutely.
But yeah, and if anyone has stuff they want to talk about specifics or type of action, yes?
I have a question. I work within the jail system,
Mhm.
teaching sexual health and empowerment, and I see abusive guards more often than not. As far as your studies on this and your experience with rape culture, what would you say is a good way to start challenging that system?
That's a really good question. And typically the type of work that I've done has been very much from the outside, so it's mostly not been challenging directly abusive guards. I mostly challenge the types of people who profit off the prison system. Within your situation, there's the question of what can you do within the capacities of your job without being fired, and also how much can you call that out? So there's the question, is there a reporting process that exists for you? If that exists, going through that could be really useful, and starting to document the types of things you're seeing. If that fails, one thing that can be really useful, if there's not an established mechanism and you don't feel that intervening directly with them is going to be useful because you think they're too far gone, what can be useful is whistleblowing. And so anonymously gather the type of evidence that you're talking about and get it out to the press and get it into the public domain so that you can get social action from outside of the prison to act in solidarity with the prisoners and to get towards stopping the abusive guards. So those are just things off the top of my head, but most of what I've done hasn't been targeting particular guards. My big thing has usually been targeting prison profiteers, and that's another thing that you can do on like an economic level, right, is most of us bank, if we don't bank with credit unions, with institutions that are invested in for-profit prisons and detention centers, that are invested in companies like CCA, which profited off the harassment, rape, and abuse of Tanya Guzman Martinez.
Can I interrupt you? Sorry. Those are convention or conference evals, so if you can just, but that's the only ones that Liz and I could find, so cross off at the top and make sure to write that it's for this. It's the same questions, it's just labeled differently at the top. So instead of asking
So
which,
just identify it's the.
just identify that it's rape culture, yes, thank you.
Thanks for getting those, Andy, I really appreciate it.
Just like cross.
I have a pen.
Yeah, you can cross that out.
We can pass around. Here you are. So, I mean, some of it means challenging structural institutions too, and that can be a big deal. But from the position you're talking about, I'm not 100% sure what the best approach is, but I'd definitely be interested in talking to you further to see what might be a good practice, because I know a lot of people who do work around prisons, so I'd be interested.
I think, I don't know what the best solution for your situation would be either. I imagine that whistleblowing would be a good one. But just like going along the general lines of challenging the norms and the myths and things like that, I think you do a great job with that on Facebook. So if any of you guys see anything that perpetuates those kind of myths or norms, don't be afraid to challenge it. I know I had an incident the other day where someone was talking about twerking and how it was bad and no self-respecting woman would ever twerk. And I'm just like, how the fuck do you know that this is a woman who has no self-respect for herself just because she's doing the twerking? Like, you're putting somebody in a box when, you know, you yourself are going to be put in a box based on the certain circumstances that you're going to encounter. I was like, that's not good. So just, I don't underestimate the power of attacking, not attacking, but challenging people that you know personally. If you see something on Facebook, there's a lot of power in doing that and just changing it one person at a time or one argument at a time.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah.